Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart podcast network.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rui Diaz through the middle to crown it for Seattle!
The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is campeón!
All creatures great and small!
You know, what was the thought process in terms of who you decided to use and who you didn't?
Ever since Sounder at Heart wrote a commentary that we didn't take Gold Cup seriously.
This episode of Nos Arietes is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Arietes since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest. Welcome back to another episode of Nos Arietes on the Sounder at Heart podcast network. I am Jeremiah Shan. It's Wednesday, December 17th, and we wouldn't normally be recording on a random Wednesday, but yesterday the Sounders broke probably the biggest piece of offseason news this year, or biggest signing at least. They are bringing in Hassani Dotson, a Federal Way native who has been with Minnesota United for the past 6 seasons, and a pretty good signing for the Sounders, especially as a depth piece. To talk about it with me, I have Nico Moreno, of course, and one of our favorite correspondents, Jeff Reuter, formerly of The Athletic. And he got to know Hassani pretty good during his time in Minnesota. Jeff, or Nico and Jeff, how are you guys doing? Nico, go ahead. How are things?
Hey, what's going on, Jeremiah? Just happy to obviously be on again, especially with Jeff, journal extraordinaire, doing all the great work out there. So just excited to hear from his side what he thinks of Hassani and the overall potential, because that's kind of where I am, having certain opinions and thoughts on it, whether, how high that potential is. So I'm excited. I love to have a good debate. So we'll talk about that. Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing well, yeah, and thanks for having me back, guys. It's awesome to be in off-season mode, right? And there's just that hard shift that MLS takes. I do appreciate it, actually, that there's so many gaps in MLS's format across the board. This is not one of them, and so I've been appreciating that, being able to get coaching hires, some signings across the board. And to your point, I was actually there when Hassani was drafted, and I remember at the time it was MLS's or Minnesota's third super draft since they had gone into Major League Soccer. And they took Dane St. Clair with their first pick. They took Chase Gasper, traded back into the first round to get Chase Gasper. And then they took Hassani at 31, which is why he wore 31 in Minnesota. And I remember speaking with Amos McGee, who is still with the club and now is with their academy, but at the time was director of player personnel, because he was often doing the college scouting. And I remember talking with him in Chicago at the draft and saying, okay, well, second rounder, they hadn't had a single guy who, if they hadn't taken in the first round, ever play a minute in Major League Soccer. So I was like, okay, do I need to get to know who this Dotson kid is? And McGee laughed and was just like, don't ask him that to his face. Like, do not ask if he's a real deal signing or not. And he was the most impressive Minnesota player of any age in their preseason. And that's a preseason where they brought in Ike Opara, Ozzie Alonso, Vito Mannone. And it was Hassani who was setting the tempo, winning the beep test, doing all of these sorts of things, where from then on, he was just pretty much part of the furniture with Minnesota through all of its changes as Adrian Heath chopped and changed the roster. And then, of course, the changeover from Heath to Colette Alamada as CSO and Eric Ramsey as the head coach, who's so beloved by Seattle Sounders fans. I think that he's been able to weather all of those. And it's exciting to be able to talk about Hassani in a focus on him, because so often players like him are not the focal point of discussions. So really excited about this one.
Well, you gave us a lot right there on Hassani out of the box, but to give a little bit more history on Dotson's time at MLS, when he first came in, I think my read on him, and I think my consistent read on him, has been sort of like a poor man's Christian Roldan, in that he does a lot of the same things. He does them well. He, at one point, I believe he had a nickname of Bangers Only. He scores some really impressive goals. Not a lot of them, but, he's got 18 goals. I would be willing to bet 12 of those are big highlight type of strikes.
Outside the box, first time touch, something like that. I agree. Yeah.
And he has some versatility too, like Roldan, where he played some right back. He has played on the wing. He's played mostly, I think he's mostly a defensive midfielder. But, can you speak a little bit to that and the way he's been positionally for Minnesota?
Yeah, and I think initially when he was drafted, first of all, he was used primarily as the backup right back, and that was out of necessity. They just simply didn't have cover at right fullback at the time. And so he was playing a lot of minutes then, which helped him get in and around the box from a different vantage point. And so when you look at, the Bangers Only mantra, 2 of his first goals are running in and kind of doing modern inverted wingback stuff at a time when he's playing on the right side of a back four against, I think it was Philadelphia and Cincinnati. So he changes his approach once he moves central. And there's something that he speaks about in a lot of interviews, like you already alluded to, grew up in Federal Way. He loved watching Ozzie Alonso play when he was a Sounders fan. And so I think it became difficult not to assume he was watching Ozzie Alonso because that's how he wanted to play the game. And I think over time, what we learned is Ozzie Alonso was just a great player to watch in his heyday, but Hassani is not a defensive midfielder in the strict sense of ball winning, positionally being a defensive anchor, these sorts of things. These are not parts that have ever really manifested Hassani's game under either coach, under either Heath or Ramsey. Instead, Hassani is much more of a box-to-box player. He does have that work rate where he wants to get involved in all phases, where he's going to be a passing outlet along a wing, or he's going to work into the midfield, willing to drop back if, his midfield partner is advancing forward, but not necessarily then coming in with that sort of like convergence that you see with like a true number 6 or something that Roldan certainly added to his game over the last few years that we weren't seeing when, as you alluded to, Hassani and Roldan maybe would have been seen as more similar players. I think right now they would be more complementary, but I also wonder if Dotson works best in a midfield trio where you do have someone else who is doing more of that, obviously the defensive screening, but also someone that can interplay and you have triangles. And I think that he works really well working into those. We haven't talked about his injuries yet, and this is probably the right time. I think in 2022 tore his right ACL, and then early 2025 tore the meniscus in his right knee. So he is right-footed, so that is inevitably something that's a concern, but it's not the plant foot, which then is usually almost more awkward for a player to come back from if they're not able to get good, stable balance as they're doing technique. But that will hamper his technique, right? And technique was never really his calling card. But I think around 23, 24, the 2 best seasons of his career, it seemed like he might be on a bit of a career trajectory akin to Sebastian Berhalter, who's a similar age, who took a while to break out, who isn't necessarily the quickest player, but has good work rate. But those injuries do keep you from refining the technique in the way that Berhalter has with Vancouver over the last 2 years, specifically with his long distribution. And so it's just a little harder to project where Hassani's best role is if it remains a 2-man midfield. But I do also think he can cover either of those roles capably. He does have enough of the skills of both roles, if we're looking at it from Vargas and Roldan in 2025, where he can do a lot of those parts, just not as specialized. And I think some of that actually is a byproduct of him being forced to play fullback at the start of his MLS career. He simply wasn't getting the training reps in midfield necessary to really bolster his credentials, either as a true box-to-box 6 with the passing range necessary, like Berhalter has alluded to, or the defensive motor and positional awareness and things. And this is something that you just see a lot with young players who get played out of position to fill gaps early in their careers. And I think that there's a few examples of this from the Adrian Heath era, but probably none more prominent than Hassani Dotson.
And just to add a little bit of context, you mentioned that he had a meniscus injury last year. It is notable that he came back. Now, he didn't make any starts after coming back, but he did play in Minnesota's last 7 games, including all 3 playoff games against the Sounders. So it does look like, my expectation is that he'll enter preseason camp fully ready to go. So to the degree that the injury is behind him, it seems like that's the case. But Niko, you sort of alluded to having maybe some skepticism about this deal. I'm guessing it's at least partly the injury, but what was your reaction to this news?
Yeah, initially, I understand it. I mean, this is a Sounders guy through and through when it comes to the just thesis of everything, and not just the local aspect, right? But the versatility, the grit, a lot of those things that are Brian Smetzer's shopping list when you talk about a player, the right mentality. But the only reason why I was initially not underwhelmed, I didn't find it interesting is because I thought that, and you guys kind of alluded to this a bit, is that for the guys that they were looking at, or it seemed like they were looking out outside of MLS, they were trying to replicate some of the things that JP, Leyva, and Obed could potentially leave out, right? You guys literally talked about it. Him and Christian do seem to almost do a lot of the same things, with the exception of that defensive tracking and just gravitating defensively. But for what I've been able to study all morning in terms of Dotson, is I don't see him being that breaking line passer for through balls into the attacking end. That's something that Obed Vargas has been really good at, breaking the ball with his possession and dribbling skills, and being that guy that overloads. Those seem to be things that some of these guys that I was kind of looking at had, and I don't know if Dotson necessarily provides those. The second one is potential. I totally understand that there was always going to be a safer move, because maybe Snyder Burnell is looked at as the high potential guy and the prospect, and the one that you're going to try to mold in. But it seems like, and this is where Jeff is going to be, very important in helping me understand this. It feels like his potential has peaked, and I don't know how much higher he can necessarily get. Part of it is injuries, of course, but it just seems like taking a secondary role last season, I don't know how much of a high ceiling type of move this could be in the scenario, of course, and this one that we got to prepare for. If Obed Vargas goes in January, February, can Dotson be that guy that holds on to that position and becomes a starter?
It's possible. And I think that you're framing it really well. And I want to come back to the point about Snyder Burnell's development as well, because I do think that actually makes this move make even more sense for a lot of the reasons you've already laid out. But I think that when you look at the potential for Hassani, it's hard. When you look at a young player, you assume there's going to be some physical development, right? And so that's simply like, I mean, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to use the Berhalter example. Speaking with him about training sessions he had in 2020 when he was about 21, 22 years old with his father, Greg, that was a lot of what they were working on, was his ability to quickly get to top speed and retain it, rather than how long does it take you to get into your stride, right? You can't really do that as well when you are, 28 going on 29 years old, which I believe Dotson is coming into this deal with Seattle. So what you look at then is you can still refine some technique, right? And maybe it is simply our movement patterns will provide you with a little more space where you can play those through balls than what Ramsey Ball was offering you. Because I don't think I need to tell any Seattle fans, Ramsey Ball is not necessarily the most spacious, pretty, possession dominant soccer you will ever see. Right. So in a different system, you see a different side of players' games. And when you go back to the Adrian Heath era, and let's say specifically 2023, look at that data, because that is going to be a little bit closer to playing actual on-ball soccer, certainly. And I think that it will actually be stylistically a little bit closer than what you saw. They certainly played in 4-2-3-1 every single game while Adrian was there. With Dotson, you're also going to see a mental evolution. And I think that this is something that he was always really standing out at once he did stick around in midfield around 2021 and stop putting in those shifts at left or right back, is that the way that he reads the field makes him very good at knowing the risks he can take. He's a really good box crasher. He's a late arriver. He's someone who's going to come in and try to provide an outlet for a shot from 20, 25 yards out, or to be able to recirculate quick, get it out to the wing, and you get a different cross. He's really good at playing both of those. But he also is exceptionally good at being in the right spot where if the ball turns over and he has to hustle back to track back to cover, not just for his own positioning, but the fullbacks maybe who've advanced, he's really good at picking his angle and getting to the attacker's intended point before them. And it's something that you even saw after he came back from the meniscus, before he had kind of another little setback. It was something that he was doing against San Jose this year. And you looked and said, okay, he does still have the mobility. Now, how much of that is going to come back after the latest one, we'll find out. But that is something that does show the mental acuity that he has to be able to make those sorts of rotations, which would be necessary if it's a two-man midfield. I also do think that with his age profile, you look and say, okay, probably 3 years of peak left, and then you're looking at who's coming in for his minutes. Well, that can be a really natural progression for Snyder, where you don't have to force him into more action, regardless of what happens with Obed, right? And so I think that having someone in prime, I also understand there's something naturally in like a really perverse way, because the examples that you were citing, Niko, were very much like international signings in a similar spot, right? And so when you see someone coming from Federal Way, on the one hand, it's like, it's great. There's someone who understands the culture, someone who grew up around the MLS version of the Sounders and will have that sort of respect for the badge and that sort of like, I'm just so glad to have my name on this jersey that I'm willing to come sign for the team. But sometimes you wonder, okay, playing close to home is always going to be a priority for a player. So does that mean that he was that safety net target where it was like, yeah, we know we can acquire him because he'll want to come back here, but does it imply that you miss some other targets? I do think his quality does bear out that he is a certified starting central midfielder in Major League Soccer. And he is close friends personally with Eric Williamson from some US U23 camps that they were in, and then beforehand as well. And I think that there are some similarities with their career trajectories, unfortunately, when you think of the injuries and the fits and the starts. But I think in a very different way, when Williamson signed with, I believe it was Charlotte last year, there was the assumption that eventually it will be to get his career back on track. And I think in a similar way, you can look and say, this isn't Dotson going back home because that's where the money is. I think it's a case where he'll also look and say, hey, there are minutes here available for me, especially after the sale of Danny Leva. And it makes a ton of sense for me to come in here now at this point in my career, rather than waiting 5 more years.
Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, which now includes Nos Arietes, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible through our paid subscribers. Plans start as low as $30 a year and allow us to remain independent and mostly ad-free. Subscribers get access to all our written and podcast content, including a full-text RSS feed and a mostly ad-free podcast feed that includes every show in one spot. If you really like what we're doing, though, I'd encourage you to sign up at our higher tiers, which include all sorts of various perks. The most popular of those is our members-only Discord, where the real Sounders sickos hang out. I know I've called this group the smartest, funniest, and best-informed Sounders fans in the world, but it's more than the rough equivalent of a Sounders Mensa meeting. Discord is where we make things happen, like for real. You know the promotion the Sounders ran that offered fans the opportunity to trade in their Messi jersey for a Paul Rothrock one? That originated in our community. You'll not only be the first to know about stuff, but you also have a semi-direct line to the movers and shakers at the Sounders organization. If you want to be one of the totally normal people who occupy the Sounder at Heart Discord, just become a supporter of Sounder at Heart. Anyway, thanks for listening, and go Durs. Nos Arietes, admittedly, is not exactly known for our spicy takes, but that doesn't mean we want our food to be mild. Spice up your life with Haxan Ferments. Handcrafted in Georgetown and made with the best local ingredients from across the Pacific Northwest, they specialize in unique small batch fermented hot sauces and vinegars. Haxan Ferments brings bold flavors and natural fermentation together for something truly special. Whether you're a heat seeker or just looking to elevate your cooking, you'll find something you love at haxanferments.com. That's HAXANFERMENTS.com. And right now, if you use the code SOUNDERATHEART, that's all one word, at checkout, you will get a free hot sauce with your order. Again, go to haxanferments.com, use the code SOUNDERATHEART at checkout for a free hot sauce with your order. Haxan Ferments is a proud sponsor of the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network. And along those lines, I also wonder if there's I always got the sense from him that there was a little chip on the shoulder when it comes to the Sounders specifically, because he didn't play in the Sounders Academy. I believe he tried out for the Sounders Academy. I'm pretty sure he tried out for S2 as well at one point. The Sounders obviously never made drafting him a priority. And so I think he always felt this need, there was this kind of sense of the Sounders have passed me over and didn't really take me seriously. And I would imagine on some level, this was also a flattering thing for him, for the Sounders to be coming to him and saying, no, we've seen what you've been doing. We like you. We think you're our kind of player. And so there is sort of this sense of, I think I can imagine him really wanting to make the most of this and prove himself. And, if it ends up being, whatever, but I have no doubt at all that he's going to come in with the mentality that I can win a starting spot. Now, whether or not on paper that's realistic, I don't know, but I think that's going to be his mentality coming in here, is that he wants to prove himself right, essentially, in all of this, and show the Sounders like, this is what you've been missing, and now I'm here to provide it, and you guys didn't make a mistake. And I mean, I like that mentality, that potential, and he seems like the kind of guy who plays with that. Like he seems humble, but he also seems like he's prideful and believes in himself, and this is a chance to sort of make that bet.
Yeah, and I saw that over the years, and it was not just when he was coming back from injuries and had that sort of internal, I need to prove it, but I need to keep calm so I don't rush this and take the wrong step and set myself back. It was also when things were going very well. Right. And it's the idea that when he is a crucial player in 23, and I believe he scores the goal that clinches a playoff spot for them that year or the year beforehand, he's not necessarily then walking around the locker room like he just took over the team and now it's his. Right. It's right. We all did this together. I was fortunate to get in the right spot, and I'm trusted myself to have the technique to do what needed to be done in the moment with the mental resolve. Right. Like he is this very well-rounded mentally sort of figure, where he was both a vital link between sort of like different factions of the locker room. This was something that happened a lot during the Heath era, where none of the coaching staff throughout his entire tenure ever spoke Spanish. So you would often see a cohort of the Spanish speakers separate from the rest of the team in like a really weird way. He was pretty vital in bridging those gaps eventually around 2021, 2020, once Emmanuel Reynoso comes in. He also was really proactive about welcoming new players to the locker room. And so whether it was super draft picks or players coming up from the academy, especially younger players, he did serve as something of a mentor for Tani Oluwaseyi, for example. So I think that there is also some locker room factor here that you can just kind of sprinkle in as like, he's a good glue guy. And once he integrates into it, he'll have the humility to not just be like, well, this is how I've always been in a locker room, and this is always how I've interacted with teammates and built social groups and these sorts of things. I think that he'll be very happy to acclimate into the existing culture and add to it from there.
To that effect, Jeff, what did you make about how publicly it became that he wanted to trade out of Minnesota? Because that's something that had caught my eye. And I went back to look at some of his audio. And this goes entwined with the fact that even in our last show, Jeremiah and I had mentioned that the Sounders were talking to Hassani Dotson, but it seemed from what I had heard that he was asking for max money, and he wanted to obviously get a better deal of the 680 he was making last season. I definitely don't think the Sounders would pay him that. I'm guessing that it's below it, just thinking of how the Sounders operate. I'm not 100% sure, but the question goes more towards how that kind of played out, and is that something that you felt like it was coming out of a bad place, or how would you kind of articulate how that whole situation played out?
Yeah, I will say that caught me off guard when that was first brought to light. I think it was with Tom Bogert at the time, and his agent speaking first to Tom, and then Hassani gave comments 2 days later in training when it was pretty unavoidable, if I remember right. And it was very out of character from what we had seen. But I think that you have to kind of appreciate his role of both continuity and upside at the time. It's a very different circumstance than where he's at in his career right now. So after 2023, when he's still on this contract that just concluded at the end of 2025, end of 2023, it's the first like bona fide Hassani Dotson is a top 10, 15 box-to-box midfielder in Major League Soccer, which isn't to say he's getting best 11 love, but no one's questioning whether or not he's the starting number 8 the following year, right? So he puts in that sort of season. He sees the contract Eric Williamson gets from the Portland Timbers. Similar CV, similar track record of success at this point, coming off of injuries. Adrian Heath is gone. Okay, well, it's going to be harder for Minnesota United to offer him that new contract when they don't have a CSO yet, with that search concluding around Christmas and then having all these other deals where players who had guaranteed deals for 2024 were never going to be the priority for them for talks. Okay, goes out in 2024, has another year much like 2023, right? Underlying numbers are a little bit different. I think he scores more, assists less, but when you look at it, like his passing rates, his defensive metrics, his just work rate, sort of like miles ran and these sorts of things. Yeah, it's still Hassani Dotson. You're still projecting it 2025. Okay. Now he wants that contract. But now Minnesota is saying, hey, we didn't really do any business last winter. This is our offseason to actually start tinkering with the squad. We have other priorities. You're under a contract in 2025. And you can understand then where if a player, the coach who signed him to the last deal is gone, and you thought you were going to be able to get your deal a year later, and now you're told, hey, you've got to wait because you've still got that deal, and we're not really renewing contracts at this point for players who have those guarantees. I can understand them where you have to take a different tactic. And it made sense that it came first from, source close to player or agent. I can't remember how it was framed, but in those situations, those only like a few people who actually might pick up the phone and call a media member. Right. So when you go from there to no, actually, I do want that move. All of that happens before the injury as well. Then you pick up the injury and then, well, you're not going to get a trade, nor should you. And you're going to have to play out the rest of your contract. And I think at that point, it made more sense to wait on free agency. I think in the benefit of hindsight, that trade wasn't going to happen. The new contract probably wasn't going to happen. I think it would have been a stalemate all season, most likely. And it would have been sort of prove it on the field and you're going to get a bigger deal from us or the next team in free agency. So it was a strange circumstance, but it seemed like one kind of born more out of needing to try something different out of necessity for what had now become over a 12-month sort of contract stalemate. And it's not even a stalemate. It was just waiting for something to kick off.
Well, it's good to hear you talk about how it was out of character. That's one of the things that I was kind of, when I'm trying to figure out a player, and this is something the Sounders do very well, which in the same line, I feel confident that he's a high intangible guy because look, whenever you have a guy like Sean Henderson involved in scouting, he's going to do his due diligence when it comes to that department. You're going to get a guy that's bought into the Sounders system, is going to come in here, perform. Brian, same thing. Those are non-negotiables for him. But it is good to hear you say that because those are one of the things that I was speculating about it and why, I wasn't necessarily thrilled about the whole thing. So I'm definitely feeling more comfortable with the move. And I think I like it. But you're helping me just become a lot more knowledgeable about the player as he's coming in, which is obviously what the whole purpose of this show is. Right, Jeremiah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's kind of one of the things I like about it is that this is if you look at what the universe of possible moves the Sounders were going to make for this spot, there were certainly higher upside moves that they could make. There was more conservative moves they could have made as well. But this seems to hit a pretty good middle ground of a player who has proven himself in MLS, who's still very much in the prime of their career, who has some real upside. Like if he ends up being this, if they move, let's just say they move Obed this winter and you start the season with Hassani Dotson starting next to Christian Roldan, I think on paper you feel pretty good about that. And you have Snyder Brunell waiting in the wings. You potentially have some other guys that you're going to be bringing in to kind of fill in around them. But if you enter the season with Obed, Vargas, Christian Roldan, and Hassani Dotson all sort of fighting for minutes, you can at least see a real rotation being put into place where you're not having to rely quite so heavily on Dotson or on just Roldan and Vargas, who played virtually every minute that they were available last year. And by the way, there's a decent chance you're going to lose Christian Roldan for some period this summer when for the World Cup. There's a chance you could lose Vargas for that matter to the World Cup. So adding depth. Yeah. So just adding depth, if nothing else, is a good move. I do like this one. One thing I wanted to ask Niko about, one thing we've been following with the Sounders this offseason is João Paulo, who has already said he's not coming back as a player. But what are you hearing as far as the coaching situation as it relates to João Paulo?
Yes, obviously, now I can go ahead and say that there has been an offer from the Sounders for him to come in as a coach for Tacoma Defiance. And I say a coach because he's more of an assistant role. He obviously has no other background other than just playing and having that ability to move into a coaching position. But additionally to that, it sounds like Tacoma Defiance, or the Sounders organization, has decided to bring in Ricardo Clark. He's an assistant coach for Vancouver, former player, and he's going to be the one that's taken over that Tacoma Defiance role. And if João Paulo was to take that offer from the Sounders, he would be an assistant to Ricardo. So that one's interesting. We haven't reported on that. We haven't, tweeted it, posted it, nothing. We're probably going to allow this show to bring that, small notice, nothing crazy. It's not a, huge move or anything like that, but it's something that, our fan base would probably like to hear. And so, I don't know what your thoughts are on that there, Jeremiah.
Well, Ricardo Clark, as people may recognize this name, he actually was a World Cup player for the U.S. national team. Unfortunately, most famous probably for being pulled before halftime in the Ghana game in 2010, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And but he had a good, he had a good career. He like I said, he was a World Cup player for the U.S. national team. He had a nice time in MLS, most recently for Houston Dynamo. And I think he may have actually been the Whitecap FC 2 head coach last year, as well as an assistant for the Whitecaps. But it's an interesting hire. It's someone who, I don't know a lot about his coaching profile, but it's certainly an interesting one. And, you like bringing in player, it can't hurt the recruitment to have a player of his CV in the organization. I would imagine maybe, I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much on that, but it's an interesting move. Of course, the Sounders also announced the signing of Stefan Fry this week, hearing some other rumors of potential signings that could be in the offing. When is the draft, Jeff? Is that tomorrow?
Thursday. Yeah. Thursday, December 18th. Yeah.
And it'll be interesting if the Sounders are how active the Sounders are going to be in that. The one player that they have that is of some note is there's a guy named Trace Terry, who they drafted last year, who they retain his MLS rights for another year. But he's someone who you could see them bringing into Defiance, most likely to compete for time there. I don't know. Do you spend much time looking at the draft these days, Jeff?
I don't know. And I'm busy thinking about like the locker room dynamic of a Ricardo Clark and João Paulo. Like the mentality monsters of that next pro team is just going to be off the charts. I cannot wait to see that. No, I think that at this point, the draft is very interesting for people who do like to see that career progression. I think that you can see that's where your players like Osaze are going to come through most likely moving forward, right? Is the idea that you're drafted, you're kind of stashed at your next pro team for a couple of years. You have a really good consistent season. You're going to graduate. But thankfully, because of that pipeline MLS team so far, I was really worried when it was going to start that the third division nature of it was going to make it a very difficult jump to make from Next Pro to MLS. I think what we're finding is actually players who excel at Next Pro tend to be doing pretty well at getting rotational roles in MLS. I'm talking like 600 to 1,200 minutes a year in Major League Soccer, but that's a $400,000 player some years of Major League Soccer, or that's a guy that might be coming in on a TAM deal too young and needs a full year to acclimate. So you're actually saving a ton of money that way. And I think you're getting players who are hungrier and maybe, pushing a little bit harder in different ways because that is what they've been, working to get. So all of this just to say the Super Draft, it's very different now. I have gotten a sense it's kind of top heavy. And some of that is actually just coming from reading the tea leaves of the trade market, where you look at a couple of teams have traded, I think for pick 3 and pick 20 have gone in the last couple of weeks. And the valuation on those are about, they're off compared to most years. Like it is really expensive now to trade into the top 3 if you're Montreal or Dallas, and it's actually really cheap to trade into the back half of it or so. So I'll be interested to see, check American Soccer Analysis, Paul Harvey there, Travis Clark, always a Top drawer. He's always got I think that you've got your resources that are far better than me, is what I'm saying. To actually get a sense of a lot of the specific prospects. I'm just talking on vibes at this point.
Yeah, I would say that if people are interested in the draft, ASA, American Soccer Analysis, and Paul Harvey have built this really cool tool that analyzes every player in college and sort of gives a draft profile of them. It's all based on numbers. It's not a lot of qualitative stuff, but it is a lot of interesting quantitative analysis. And you can see how players
in 2024 as well. I should add, it looks like
very
it shows us homework too, but it had a very good hit rate last year. So I'm using it too. Yeah. No, exactly. Well, I guess that's it. Of course, the Sounders are probably going to go do something that messes this up and makes this a little bit less timely. But I wanted to get something on the record about Dotson. I think it's a relatively significant move. It's worthy of spending some time. Jeff, thank you so much for giving us some insight into Hassani's background. Niko, thank you for hopping on here doing this sort of emergency podcast. Anything going on with you, Jeff, that we should be knowing about? I'm on Tuesdays right now. I'm still doing Total Soccer Show MLS Weekly. So we talked yesterday. We broadened the scope a bit to the USL and the NWSL as well, because it was just Taylor, Rockwell, and I. But stay tuned. I should be back to writing more regularly soon. And I look forward to it. Yep.
Like that teaser. And of course, Niko, you're still doing soccer down here, lobbing Scorchers. We are always looking for ways to get you even more involved on Sounder at Heart. Anything else you want to plug, Niko?
No. I think that's everything. I mean, I'll be try to be pretty active in regards to following up on the Paul Rothrock situation and see where that leads. You obviously just my Twitter is where or my X is where you'll find a lot of it. I'm doing better on Blue Sky. I'll tell you that. I'm
good.
Throw some stuff in there. I'm really working hard, trying to get it out there. But yeah, no, other than that, I'm just excited to hear what's next for the Sounders.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get out of here. I am Jeremiah Shan signing off for Nos Arietes, which is part of the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, and we will catch you next time.
Let's go Sounders.